What if a house refuses to let its residents live? Why does everyone who moves into unit number 8 begin to waste away? And most terrifying of all, what is hidden inside the walls, where every test says nothing is wrong? March 1985. A cold spring settled over a small town in Ohio, deep in the heart of the Rust Belt. Among the abandoned warehouses and shuttered factories, a brand-new 12-story apartment complex had just been finished. It stood on the site of a demolished industrial lot that city officials had hurriedly cleared. No one really knew what had been there before. For the Miller family, moving into this place felt like the beginning of a better life. Richard Miller, 42, worked as a survey engineer at the steel plant. His wife Susan, 38, kept the books for a local food company. Their daughter Emily, 15, was a quiet, dreamy girl who loved sketching and reading novels. They had been renting a worn-down apartment near the railroad tracks. Now they had a spacious home of their own, with a gas stove, hot water, and a balcony overlooking the empty lot. First, everything seemed perfect. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, families exchanged visits, and life felt full of promise. Richard watched TV in the evenings, Susan decorated the kitchen with bright curtains, and Emily wrote in her diary about her new room and the shelves she wanted to build for her books. But within weeks, unease began to creep in. The air inside their apartment never seemed fresh, no matter how wide the windows were thrown open. It carried a heavy, metallic taste that clung to the walls. Susan told a friend she sometimes felt like a stone pressed against her chest. Richard developed a dry, barking cough that wouldn't go away, though he had never smoked. Emily often complained of waking at night with a crushing weight in her chest, as if something unseen pressed down on her. By May, Susan was waking up with nosebleeds. She blamed stress, but the sudden headaches and draining weakness didn't feel like fatigue. Richard came home from work more and more exhausted, collapsing onto the couch, his temper short. Even the joy of the new home seemed to fade into a quiet dread the family couldn't quite name. At night, the electricity flickered. Lights dimmed and appliances shut off on their own. A city electrician checked the wiring but shrugged. Nothing wrong. Just don't run the fridge and TV at the same time. But the cold heaviness inside their chests lingered. By early summer, the Millers realized the bright new chapter they had dreamed of was becoming something else entirely. The walls that were supposed to protect them seemed to hold a life of their own. And no one yet understood that apartment 8 was only beginning to write its terrifying story. By the summer of 1985, the Millers' new beginning had turned into something else entirely. Susan was the first to change. She started losing weight, at first just a few pounds, then so quickly her clothes hung loose around her shoulders. Nosebleeds came at night, sudden and inexplicable. She would wake with the sheets stained dark, clutching tissues, telling Richard it was nothing, just the stress of the move, maybe her sinuses. But stress didn't explain the trembling weakness in her arms, or why her skin sometimes looked almost translucent under the kitchen light. Emily's complaints sounded stranger. She whispered to her mother that she hated sleeping alone, because at night her chest felt heavy, as if someone pressed down on her ribcage with invisible hands. "Like I can't breathe," she said one morning, her face pale and drawn. Susan tried to soothe her, blamed it on growing pains or nightmares, but she had begun to feel the same weight herself, an unseen presence that settled into her lungs when the apartment went quiet. Richard, once the strongest of them, began to unravel in ways he couldn't ignore. He had always been a man of steady routine. Long shifts at the steel plant, dinner at 6, a drink before the evening news. But by late summer he was restless, unable to sleep more than an hour at a time. He woke drenched in sweat, coughing into his fists until his throat burned. His cough had no phlegm, no relief, just a hollow bark that seemed to tear his chest apart. At work, his hands shook so badly he could barely handle his tools. Doctors found nothing definite. A local physician prescribed inhalers, allergy tablets, vitamins. Blood tests came back inconclusive. When Richard asked why his muscles ached and his nights were filled with endless fatigue, the doctor muttered about nervous exhaustion and told him to rest. Rest, as if sleep were possible in that apartment. By early 1986, the truth became undeniable. Richard collapsed one morning, unable to stand, his legs refusing to hold him. Susan rushed him to the hospital, where specialists finally delivered the verdict. A rare and aggressive lymphoma, the kind they usually saw in men twice his age. The disease spread with shocking speed. Within weeks, he could no longer work. Within months, he was confined to a hospital bed, hollowed out by something inside him that medicine couldn't stop. On April 15, 1986, Richard Miller died. The death certificate listed systemic organ failure caused by advanced lymphoma. He was 42 years old. Susan followed soon after. Her decline mirrored her husband's: rapid weight loss, exhaustion, then the cruel certainty of leukemia. Doctors noted abnormal bone marrow growth, but shrugged when asked why such cases appeared in an otherwise healthy woman. By July, she was gone, her body failing in the same sterile hospital ward where Richard had taken his last breath. Emily was 15 when she buried both parents within months of each other. She moved in with her aunt across town, carrying only a box of her clothes and her diary. The apartment that had promised a new beginning was left behind. Locked, silent, and already whispered about by neighbors who sensed it wasn't just bad luck. For the Millers, apartment number 8 had been a home for barely a year. For the building itself, their deaths were only the beginning. By the spring of 1987, apartment number 8 was locked and empty. The Millers were gone, their belongings boxed away, their names already fading from the gossip of the building. Neighbors avoided speaking about what had happened. Death was uncomfortable, and tragedy was easier to forget. But the building did not forget. On the floor above, in apartment number 18, the Harper family moved on with life as if nothing unusual had occurred one level below. Thomas Harper worked maintenance at the rail yard, a steady man with calloused hands. His wife, Linda, stayed home with their 6-year-old son, Matthew, a boy who loved to build forts out of couch cushions and run down the echoing stairwells. For a while, they seemed untouched by the shadow that had swallowed the Millers. Then the sickness began again. Linda was the first. By late summer, she complained of constant fatigue, nosebleeds, and an ache deep inside her bones. She lost her appetite, lost weight, and then lost her ability to climb the stairs without gasping for breath. Within a month, Thomas, too, began to weaken. His co-workers whispered about how pale he looked, how often he leaned against the railings for support. By October, both parents were in and out of hospitals, tested for everything from pneumonia to workplace exposure. And then Matthew, only 6, began to cough. At first it was mild, just a rasp that sounded strange on a child's lips. But the cough lingered, turned violent, left him clutching at his chest as tears streamed down his face. Doctors ordered chest x-rays, found nothing definitive, and prescribed stronger inhalers. None of it helped. By early 1988, all 3 were dead. Linda first, then Thomas, then Matthew within weeks of each other. Their funerals blurred together in the town's memory. Neighbors whispered that it was grief that killed the boy, that children cannot survive the death of their parents. But others looked down the stairwell toward apartment number 8 and wondered if something darker lived in those walls. The building began to rot from the inside, not just in lives but in whispers. Strange patterns emerged. Miscarriages became more frequent. 2 women on the 5th floor lost pregnancies within the same month. Babies who did survive were sometimes born with defects, hearing problems, respiratory issues, brittle bones. It was coincidence, the doctors said. It was chance. But the women who sat together in the courtyard shaking their heads didn't believe in chance anymore. Even the air felt unstable. Electrical currents sputtered. Lights flickered. In the evenings, entire apartments would suddenly fall into darkness, while the hallway lights burned steady and strong. Frustrated tenants called the city's electricians. Men in overalls arrived with clipboards, tested outlets, examined fuse boxes. Each time the report came back the same: no issues found. Wires were intact, circuits were functional, voltage levels within normal range. And yet, the residents knew something was wrong. They lived by candlelight when the bulbs dimmed, swore they heard buzzing in the walls even when the power was out. More than one neighbor claimed to feel a vibration beneath their feet, as though the building itself hummed with some secret frequency no machine could register. By the end of the decade, the deaths of the Harpers were already blending with those of the Millers, stitched together into rumor. People lowered their voices in the stairwells. They said the building was cursed. They said it had been built on poison ground. But the most disturbing whispers came from those who remembered how quickly the Harpers had fallen ill after the Millers. It was as if the sickness moved upward, creeping from one apartment to the next, waiting for a new family to claim. And if the doctors couldn't see it, if the electricians couldn't detect it, then what was really hiding inside the concrete? By the early 1990s, the building had already earned a reputation no one wanted to say aloud. Apartment number 8 remained empty most of the time. Families would move in, paint the walls, unpack their furniture, and then, within months, pack it all up again and disappear. They never gave clear reasons, only muttered about feeling drained or suffocated. Some spoke of rashes that spread across their arms, welts that appeared without cause. Their doctors found nothing unusual, nothing to explain why otherwise healthy adults looked like they had been living next to industrial waste. And so the rumors began. Old-timers in town said the land where the tower stood had once been used for storage tanks and chemical drums, back when the steel plant was still roaring. Others swore it had been federal property, an abandoned military site dating back to the Cold War, when the government had scattered secret bunkers across the Midwest. The stories varied, but they all carried the same weight. The ground was poisoned long before the concrete rose. No one could prove anything. The city's planning office claimed the archives had been lost during a fire. The county clerk shrugged and said the documents were never properly filed. Whatever records might have explained the site's history had vanished, erased by accident or by design. Still, whispers spread faster than the official denials. Neighbors told newcomers not to linger in the stairwell near the 8th unit. They said the air there was heavier, that breathing felt like pulling dust into your lungs. Visitors noticed too, though they couldn't explain it. One young couple who briefly rented the place told friends that every morning they woke with a sour taste in their mouths, as if the walls themselves gave off fumes during the night. And when the couple finally broke their lease and left, their landlord asked why. The woman simply answered, "It's not a home. It doesn't want us there." Apartment number 8 remained dark, its windows like dead eyes watching the courtyard. Every time new tenants arrived, the residents of the building exchanged glances and waited, wondering how long this family would last before the sickness, the weight, the silence inside those walls drove them out again. In the autumn of 1993, after years of silence, apartment number 8 lit up again. The Carters moved in, a retired couple who wanted nothing more than a quiet place to live out their days. Michael Carter had spent decades repairing machinery at the Ford plant before it shut down. His wife, Diane, had once worked as a school librarian. They were simple people, cautious with money, grateful when the city offered them the apartment at a low rate. They didn't ask about its history. They didn't want to know why no one else seemed to stay. At first, the Carters tried to make the place warm. Diane brought in her houseplants, lined them across the balcony rail. Michael patched the peeling wallpaper and hung an old clock above the kitchen table. But within days, the strangeness began. At night, they heard sounds in the walls, groans, creaks, a rhythmic scratching as though something moved inside the concrete itself. Michael insisted it was nothing more than pipes shifting with the weather, but Diane wasn't convinced. She woke him one night, trembling, after hearing what she swore was a voice murmuring low through the vents. Then came the smell. It drifted through the living room like smoke from a match just snuffed out. The sharp, acrid tang of burnt metal. The odor clung to the curtains and their clothes, and no amount of cleaning could erase it. Moisture spread through the walls, darker and wetter each week. Condensation ran down the windows, even when the air outside was cold and dry. In the bedroom, damp spots blossomed into stains the color of ash. When Michael scrubbed them away, they returned within days, larger than before. Diane's health was the first to collapse. She grew pale and weak, her breath shallow. Her once gentle hands trembled when she tried to hold a book. Within 3 months she was hospitalized, her condition deteriorating so quickly the doctors were baffled. Tests revealed damage to her internal organs so severe one specialist whispered to a colleague, "It's as if her body has been burned from the inside out." They labeled the death a stroke with complications, but privately admitted they had never seen organs so scarred, so charred, in a woman with no history of illness. Diane Carter died in January 1994. Michael lasted only a few weeks after her funeral. Not because of sickness, at least not yet, but because he couldn't bear the apartment anymore. He told his daughter the place was wrong, that he could hear Diane's last rattled breaths in every creak of the floorboards. He left with only a suitcase, turning in the keys without a word to his neighbors. For the building, it was another death, another chapter. For apartment number 8, it was the third. 3 families had lived there. 3 families had been broken. And though no official report ever connected them, the residents whispered it in hallways, behind closed doors, in voices barely above a breath. Apartment number 8 was cursed. By the mid-1990s, the building itself seemed to be unraveling. Even outside apartment number 8, the signs were everywhere. Quiet, unsettling, impossible to explain. On the 5th floor, a woman named Mrs. Parker kept a collection of houseplants she had tended for years. Ferns, violets, a spider plant that had once spilled green across her windowsill. Within weeks of moving them into her new apartment, every one of them shriveled and died. Not slowly, not with the gradual yellowing of leaves, but almost overnight, as if poisoned. She replaced the soil, bought fresh plants, and watched them wither the same way. Pets began to act strangely. A Persian cat that had lived peacefully with its owner for years suddenly hissed at empty corners, refused to eat, and then disappeared one evening, never found again. A neighbor's dog, usually docile, turned violent without warning, snapping at its owner before bolting down the stairwell and out into the night. Flyers went up, but no animals returned. Even the building's vanes seemed infected. Electricians called to repair power outages found wires that looked eaten away. Insulation melted in strange, precise patches as if something acidic had chewed through them. Yet there were no burn marks, no evidence of fire. One report described the copper itself as corroded in a manner inconsistent with normal wear. The paperwork was filed away, never mentioned again. And then came George Cutter. George was not a man to be frightened by flickering lights or strange smells. He was a retired engineer, once employed in radiation safety for a federal research facility in Pennsylvania. His son had recently purchased an apartment in the building, and George moved in temporarily to help with renovations. It didn't take long before his old instincts stirred. Neighbors told him about the families who had died, about the sickness, about apartment number 8. George didn't laugh it off. He asked questions. He listened carefully. And then he brought out a tool he had kept since his working days. A personal dosimeter, outdated but reliable, its metal casing scuffed from decades of use. Room by room he tested the air, the walls, the floors. The readings came back normal. 0. Nothing. Yet George didn't trust the silence of the device. He had seen too much in his career to believe in nothing. He decided on an experiment. In the corridor of his son's unit, near the ceiling where the wall met the concrete slab above, George taped a strip of old photographic paper. In theory, if radiation was present, something subtle, something his dosimeter couldn't catch, the paper would darken over time. He left it for a week. When he returned, the edges of the paper had turned a faint but undeniable gray, as though something invisible had burned a shadow into the surface. Not strong, not obvious, but real. George Cutter felt a chill he hadn't known since the days he'd walked restricted zones with a Geiger counter in his hand. He understood the implications immediately. Whatever haunted this building wasn't a ghost, wasn't superstition. It was physical. It was inside the concrete itself. His suspicion grew into a theory that somewhere in the slabs and panels used to construct the tower, an alien element had been sealed. Something radioactive, unstable, something never meant to be in a residential building. Hidden in plain sight. And if his hunch was right, then every breath the tenants took, every night they spent behind those walls, brought them closer to the same fate as the Millers, the Harpers, and Diane Carter. The story might have ended there, just whispers in stairwells and rumors of cursed concrete, if not for a young reporter at the Lakewood Herald. Her name was Natalie Kirk, 27 years old, sharp-eyed, restless, the kind of journalist who lived for the stories no one else wanted to touch. Most of her colleagues filled their columns with school board meetings and ribbon cuttings. Natalie preferred the letters from readers that smelled of scandal, the anonymous tips left on her desk with trembling handwriting. One morning in late autumn, she found a plain envelope waiting for her in the newsroom mail slot. No return address, no stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. The paper inside was yellowed, creased, its edges brittle. The first page was a letter, written in hurried script. The building at 7th and Pierce was not built with ordinary concrete. In 1985, a batch of panels came from the Riverside industrial plant. Those panels were contaminated. They held material never meant for housing, material stored in seal drums from the waste yards. You should look into it. People are dying there. Attached to the letter were photocopies of official-looking documents. The ink was faded, the signatures blurred, but the headers were unmistakable. Internal Investigation Report, June 5, 1985. Another read. Waste Materials Log, Q1, 1985. Natalie spread the papers across her desk, her pulse quickening. The report described unusual luminous activity inside hardened concrete, an uncharacteristic density in certain slabs, and trace elements not consistent with standard mixes. The language was clinical, detached, but the meaning was clear. Something had been sealed into the panels when they were poured. The waste log was worse. 2 shipments of material, listed as industrial byproducts from a closed section of the plant, had been redirected to the same panel line used in residential construction. The initials of the supervisor were scrawled in the corner, a note reading, "No intervention required. Proceed with use." The final page chilled her most of all. It was a grainy black and white photograph, clearly taken in haste. It showed a rough surface of concrete, a fracture line across the middle. Embedded within the slab was a jagged piece of metal, its edges corroded, partially entombed in cement. Faint but unmistakable in the upper corner was a faded symbol, the trefoil of radiation hazard, half buried, but visible. Next to it, in handwriting so shaky it seemed written by a trembling hand, were two words, "Do not breach." Natalie sat back, staring at the evidence, her throat dry. If the documents were real, and she had no reason to think otherwise, it meant that the rumors were true. The building was not cursed. It was poisoned, deliberately, carelessly, with no warning to the people who had moved their families into those walls. She folded the papers carefully, slid them back into the envelope, and locked it in her desk drawer. Already she could feel a prickle on her skin, a tremor of fear that the anonymous sender knew more than they should. For the first time, the deaths at apartment number 8 were not just whispers. They had a paper trail, and Natalie Kirk was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. Natalie tried to push the story. She brought the documents to her editor, laid out the timeline, the deaths, the photograph of the slab with the radiation symbol. He listened in silence, then closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. "Drop it," he said. "We don't pick fights with the city, or with the feds." From that day on, the newsroom grew colder around her. Colleagues avoided her desk. Her calls to agencies went unanswered. When she phoned one of the independent labs for a second opinion, the man on the other end lowered his voice. "Don't touch this. The building is certified clean. On paper, it's harmless. That's all that matters." Within a week, she noticed her phone line clicking, faint bursts of static whenever she picked it up. Sometimes she swore she heard voices bleeding through, fragments of conversations that weren't hers. And then the men arrived. Neighbors later recalled seeing them. 3 figures in dark uniforms without insignia. They entered the building late at night, carrying cases that looked like equipment. They stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. No one could say what they did, but when they left, they carried out a small, heavy container, sealed and metallic. The next morning, apartment number 8 was different. The door was gone, replaced by a sheet of cold steel bolted into the frame. No lock, no handle, just a smooth barrier of metal sealing it off from the rest of the building. The neighbors whispered. The apartment had finally been buried alive. Natalie wrote all of it in her notebook. But when she tried to publish, the answer was always the same. No story here. The building stood silent, the 8th unit now nothing more than a welded tomb. It started with fire. One winter night, flames licked out from the windows of the 7th floor, black smoke curling into the sky. Fire crews arrived quickly and put it out, but the damage left questions no one could answer. The burn pattern didn't match an ordinary electrical blaze. A section of wall in apartment number 8 had cracked from floor to ceiling, though the flames had never touched it. The firefighters who carried out their hoses whispered about the smell. Sharp, metallic, like iron scorched in a furnace. After that night, the building seemed to rot faster. Hairline fractures spread across stairwell walls. Ceilings leaked brown water even when the weather was dry. Tenants said the air carried a bitter tang, the same burnt metal scent that clung to their clothes. Children coughed through the nights, and several adults were rushed to hospitals with sudden respiratory failure. The doctors were baffled. The official reports listed causes like acute pulmonary edema or rare alveolar necrosis, diseases usually seen in chemical workers after decades of exposure. But these were office clerks, retirees, children. Within a few months, at least 4 residents were dead, their lungs described in autopsy notes as scorched from within. That was when the city stepped in. Not with answers, not with truth, but with an evacuation order. Officials declared the high-rise structurally unsound, citing cracks in the foundation and unremediable defects. One by one, tenants were moved out, offered cramped units across town. Some resisted, demanding explanations, but the bulldozers of bureaucracy rolled over them all the same. By spring, the building was silent. A chain-link fence wrapped around it, topped with razor wire. A sign read, "Condemned. No entry." Behind it, the tower loomed like a mausoleum. And then the trucks came. Residents who lived nearby swore they saw it. Convoys arriving at dawn, flatbeds and covered rigs with canvas tarps pulled tight over their loads. Inside, piece by piece, the building was dismantled. Panels were pried free and hauled away, disappearing into the fog of interstate highways. No one ever learned where they were taken. Journalists tried, Natalie Kirk among them, but every request for access was denied, every inquiry deflected. Police cruisers idled near the fence when reporters gathered. Once, a cameraman was shoved back, his film confiscated, told the site was restricted for safety reasons. From the street, you could see the scars. Gaping holes where concrete slabs had been removed. Piles of rubble that never stayed for long. At night, security lights bathed the building in sterile white glow. While the windows of apartment number 8 remained sealed, the steel plate gleaming faintly under the floodlamps. The tower had become an autopsy in progress, its bones stripped and carried away. But no report would ever tell what had truly been inside those walls. And for the people who once lived there, those who buried their families, those who left with lungs scarred and eyes hollow, the truth was already clear. The building wasn't collapsing. It was being erased. Natalie Kirk never stopped writing. In the back pages of her notebook, beneath scribbled timelines and photocopied notes, she left one final entry. The words were scrawled in violet ink, written in a hand more urgent than her usual careful script. There was a source in the wall. They didn't miss it. They didn't fail to see it. They chose not to. This isn't an investigation. It's an epitaph. 2 weeks later, Natalie disappeared. Her apartment door was locked from the inside. No signs of a break-in. Her phone, her wallet, her typewriter, all still in place. Only one thing was gone. The strip of film she had guarded, the photograph of the fractured panel with the radiation symbol buried in cement. Her disappearance was never declared foul play. The police called it a voluntary absence. The paper ran a single paragraph. Local reporter unaccounted for. After that, her name slipped into the same silence that had already claimed so many. And the building? It didn't last long either. On city maps, it was reclassified, then condemned. Within months, it was struck from public records altogether. A parking lot now covers the place where its foundations once stood. Clean asphalt hiding what had been buried beneath. To the casual eye, nothing remains. But silence is not erasure. Neighbors still whisper that the panels, those slabs of poisoned concrete, weren't destroyed. They were loaded onto trucks, driven out under canvas tarps, and scattered into other construction projects across the Midwest. A school in Indiana, a housing complex in Michigan, maybe even another tower in Ohio. No one knows where. No one ever will. What remains is rumor, shadow, and the quiet certainty that what was hidden in apartment number 8 didn't simply vanish when the walls came down. Natalie's final line still echoes, heavier than any headline she ever printed. The archives do not live in paper. They live in bodies, in the walls that still stand somewhere. And somewhere they are still standing.